Welcome back to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. Looking forward to talking about learning science and learning engineering. With me, I'm joined by Ulrich Boser, the founder of the Learning Agency and the Learning Agency Labs. Ulrich, welcome to Trending in Education.
Thanks so much for having me here. Really grateful.
Yeah, and as I've been digging around, looking at what's new and what's emerging trend-wise, there are some long-standing trends that are continuing to see traction. One of them is really around the concept of learning science. We've talked about learning science several different times on Trending in Education, but I'd love to get your perspective as someone who was in on this concept and really evangelizing the power of learning science, 5-10 years ago. I'd love to get some of your longer view on what learning science is and how is it an emerging trend that folks should be keeping track of.
Yeah, really happy to discuss this. Been working on science of learning for quite a while and seeing also some trends within that I think really would be of interest to your audience.
Great. So what would you call learning science? How would you define it? Or is that a term that you use?
Sure, yeah. So learning science, science of learning, I would define that, or I see it as the body of work that goes around exactly how people learn. And it has sort of two strands to it. One is focused on social and emotional learning. And then a second aspect of it is really focused on memory. And when we learn something, we store it in our memory. And how our memory works has some distinct patterns, and we can study those through research, through replicable research, and they really have powerful implications for how people learn and that are valuable to anyone who's trying to learn or teach anything, whether it's a e-learning course or trying to get someone who works with you to figure out that very important accounting software.
Yeah. So on the subject of the social emotional side, that's something that I like to quote Whitney Houston and say, I get socio-emotional, baby, because I like to burst into song occasionally on the show, and our listeners allow me to do that. But what's new and emerging in terms of that domain? Because it was something within the last, say, 5 to 10 years, second half of the 2010s, it seemed to be something that was such a rising tide that maybe it was getting a little stale. So I would be curious from your perspective, what's new and emerging within the domain of social and emotional learning, heading into the 2020s?
Yeah, so in my mind, when it comes to the science of learning, what is new and I think what's really important for folks to pay attention to is the application of it. So we now have decades of research behind some very discrete principles like retrieval practice, this very simple idea that if you pull something out of your brain, you're going to learn it a lot more. And so, this is a hard practice to do at scale. So we know about retrieval practice, but, just even recently I was preparing for a speech, and retrieval practice would suggest that I should put the speech away and just, sit in a room by myself and speak it out loud. But it's so easy to just, get caught reading the speech over and over again.
Right.
So when we look across the landscape, just seeing different platforms, different educators, whether it's, more low stakes quizzing, trying to encourage retrieval practice more in online platforms. So people summarizing research, really seeing that transition from, okay, this is now really clear. It works in the lab. What does it look like in classrooms? And what does it look like in different classrooms?
Right.
We know these principles work, but like in medicine, there are going to be different populations, different contexts when these types of interventions work more. And so now really trying to understand, when does it work for who and when, and taking these principles and really making sure that they work for educators and work for students.
That's awesome. Yeah, it reminds me of the old saw of the kid saying, "Are we going to be quizzed on this?" And it turns out he was a budding learning scientist, because if he knew that he was in fact going to be quizzed on it, he was more likely going to pay attention because he was going to be quizzed. I mean, that's the reality. And then secondly, by virtue of being quizzed, it would help consolidate and reinforce his memory. The other part of the social emotional that I'd love to get your perspective on is really the first part of that example, the motivation side. Like how do we think about really gaining the learner's attention and then motivating them to lean into the hard work of learning. Because the other concept that you were putting out there reminded me of the idea of desirable difficulty too, where like you actually want to have enough resistance in the system to kind of keep the learner engaged, but not too hard. And then if it's too easy, maybe they drift. So I'd love to get some of your perspective as a thought leader in learning science. How does the motivation side of the equation work?
Yeah, motivation is incredibly complex. I think, as all of us know, sometimes you're looking to do things for the reward. Sometimes you're doing for that intrinsic motivation. And
Mm-hmm.
when I think about the trends within that specific field, really just growing more and more interested in seeing more and more people talk about Chris Holman's work. He's down at UVA and really trying to think about relevancy. And when you think about relevancy, I think he does a nice job at saying it's really from the audience to the material. So a lot of times people think about, oh, I'm going to make this material interesting, let's say statistics, by just maybe sprinkling in Whitney Houston jokes
Yes.
or talking about baseball, right? And
Right.
that's sort of one way, right? That's going to be of interest to the people who watch baseball or even just care about sports. And from his research, what he's found is that if you find people to create their own connections to the work, that's really a lot more powerful. So if you were to, as an example, have each person write down, why they need to learn statistics. For some individuals, it might be that they know that they're going to become a nurse and they need to understand that maybe, they like gambling, maybe,
Right.
whatever it is that makes it relevant to them. And so I found that really powerful, this idea,
Mm-hmm.
and seeing more and more people talking about it, that motivation and relevancy in that is really this one way. It's not something necessarily being created by the platform or the environment or the kind of educational ecosystem. It's really from the person to the material. And so what are
Right.
ways that we can spark people to get interested in that way?
And I imagine that's a fascinating answer. And I imagine that triggers some challenges to the instructional designer too, where if you can't, if there isn't relevance to what you're teaching, if there's a misalignment of the skills that you're teaching to the audience's level of engagement, it almost requires you to go back to the drawing board and start thinking about, well, why am I teaching statistics? Like what? So I think there's there's a second side, I guess, to relevancy when it comes to designing instruction. And could you talk a little bit about that? I'd be curious your take.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's some material where people are really excited to jump in on, and we all have those wiki pages where we want to learn about some little thing that you or happen to geek out on. Then there's other material, right, where it's Excel pivot tables. I'm going to go out on a limb here and just say that I don't think there are a lot of people out there who wake up in the morning and are like, oh, Excel pivot tables. That's what I need to learn today. But sometimes, you need to eat those vegetables. And so
Right.
then the question is, these vegetables, and those vegetables are going to be, broadly speaking, different for different people. It's sort of how you present those. And then, how at the beginning, you can even just say like, hey, today we're going to learn about Excel pivot tables. How are you going to find this useful in your work? How are you going to find this useful? And some people are going to say, yeah, this is going to be great for my office job. Some people are going to say, hey, I'm planning a wedding, and this is going to be a great way for me to figure out how much in debt I'm going to go, or how much in debt my children are going to go. And so really just trying to bring people along so they can find out how they are going to make it relevant to their own lives, as opposed to, I think, in a lot of instructional designers and really anyone. It's just sort of a metacognitive problem. You just assume people are going to be interested, or they're going to be interested in the same reason that you're interested in, as opposed to letting them find their own way, their own connection.
I love where you were going with that, because that also, reinforces the idea of the benefit of a diverse and inclusive group, especially when they can hear each other's takes. Because then, as an instructor, you can start to demonstrate in the spreadsheet example, demonstrate the flexibility of the tool and the fact that us humans are so great at applying, tools to novel situations. Really, really, really interesting stuff there.
And I get excited about this topic as well, and I think trying as you said to, be inclusive. And then also I'd like where you had set that up, but also allowing people to also really bring their own histories to that,
Yeah.
and acknowledging that these are going to be different paths that we're on as we learn.
Yeah, fascinating stuff on the social emotional side. And the other thing that, if we get a chance, I'd love to get your perspective on artificial intelligence. And so, like, how we recently did a few shows about some forecasting that was saying, it's likely that human creativity will still outstrip AI's ability to make a lot of lateral connections and be quote unquote creative in a lot of the ways that we currently measure human creativity for at least the next 10 years. And that, as a future facing trend spotting educational show, that opened up a lot of really interesting questions around, what will continue to be human, what may be a blend of human and non-human. And then thinking about how emotional intelligence kind of can connect to that, like where humans are going to have to be able to work both with AI and with other humans to kind of be effective in the future. So lots to chew on there,
Yeah, I mean, I would push back, and this is certainly a joke that a lot of people make, or have made. You say AI if you want to get headlines, and
Yeah.
you refer to sort of machine learning or Python scripts,
Yeah.
if you really want to embrace the folks who are excited to, get into the nitty gritty. And when we talk about AI, it's just such a huge concept. Trying to break that down, I think, is really important. I'd really argue that natural language processing, which is of course a subset of AI, is by far going to have the most impact when we think about education in the next years. And some of these other AI things, while exciting, like making lateral connections, are really pretty far off.
Yes.
Well, NLP is something that it still has lots of hurdles. The machines still don't really understand human language, but a tremendous amount of applications there for education that are really rich. Seeing some of them rolled out already. And, beyond that hype, as people think about AI, just trying to go into those specific domains, like emotion detection or feedback, or, machine learning or big data. But, within that, I think NLP, this natural language processing, is really the trend in the shorter term that I think can have a much bigger impact.
Yeah, no, that's great insight. And related to that, there's this concept of learning engineering as opposed to learning science, or as sort of like an additional context to apply to how you think about learning more broadly. It does seem to relate to some of this as these emerging technologies, whether it's around natural language processing or other emerging technologies. As I understand it from what you were describing as we were setting up, the learning engineering is almost the connection to technology and digital solutions. I'd love to hear, maybe you flesh out a little more the distinction between learning science, or the science of learning, and learning engineering.
Sure. I know you've had other folks on the show like Brewer Saxberg. I'm a huge fan of his, really one of the pioneers in this work, talking about, learning engineers, and as a way of thinking about richer forms of instructional design. As our team and other groups have been involved in the space, the learning engineering has a slightly different flavor to it, and really thinking about computer science meets science of learning. And for us, that's really thinking about, how can we use these big platforms, big data, to better understand how people learn. And this is a show, of course, talking about trends and those new ideas that excite people within education. But there are some like basic, rudimentary concepts in education that we actually don't have good research on. My favorite example is, should feedback be immediate or delayed? So when you mentioned desirable difficulties, Bob York's work, he'll argue that it's better if feedback's a little bit delayed. It makes it a little bit more difficult. There's another body of research that says feedback should be immediate. Now, on my side, what I find remarkable is this question, feedback, immediate or delayed, is incredibly important, whether you're like potty training, getting someone to do Excel pivot tables,
right.
Learning
figure whether to leave the blackjack table or not. Yeah.
So, in my mind, that we don't have a good answer to that is just remarkable. So how can we then use big data, big platforms to figure out the answer to this? And I think many other important questions in education. And that's really what learning engineering is about. taking large platforms, big data, really the tools of modern data science, and using them to do better work at understanding the science of learning. And there's some great innovators in this field, Neil Heffernan at Assessments, Ryan Baker at Penn, and they're all approaching it from somewhat different angles, but doing some fascinating work, melding that kind of computer science plus learning that I think is really, really fascinating and potentially quite powerful.
Yeah, and a lot of the real innovation happens when you get interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary. You sort of break out of a single silo and sort of like the equivalent of Ghostbusters crossing the streams. You take a little bit of computer science and then you bring the science of learning in, and it's a beyond an additive interaction. You actually sort of increase in a more profound way, and that's really the promise of AI too. Like as the instrumentation of our learning experiences get better, you start collecting data points that then can really refine and tune the interventions that are given to you, the real promise of adaptivity. Those are the types of things that may be unlocked in the next, say, 5 to 10 years. It's kind of an exciting time to be at those points of intersection, I imagine.
Yeah, it is. It's really exciting because what we see from big data and from CS is just really lots of exciting new tools, whether they're in natural language processing or emotion detection. I mentioned Neil Heffernan recently, where they've been doing some really interesting work on wheel spinning. So, yeah, and I think the name of the paper is, it's something along the lines of, can grit go too far? These instances where a student, and this could be on any platform, answers, 7, 10 questions in a row incorrectly. And, that's something that we're increasingly able to detect. Clearly not something that we want students to do. It leads to that sense of kind of frustration and powerlessness that we know leads to dropping out. And how can we use tools to identify that early, not too early, right, to reduce that grittiness, but enough so that, and certainly I remember like skiing for the first time, you fall down again and again. It's just like, oh my God, I just want to go home. How can we prevent that feeling from happening?
You could probably figure out a way to prevent golfers from throwing their clubs into the water, for example, among other things. We got some time on the social emotional stuff, which was great. Whitney Houston got her due. We also spent some time talking about the engineering and the intersection between the science of learning and computer science. I'd like to maybe close with your thoughts on what's new and emerging more on the cognitive side, like the more application of learning, stuff that we learn about learning that sometimes maybe stays a little more abstract and doesn't turn into practice. I'd love to get some of your perspective on what's new and what's emerging on the more cognitive side, because I'm always fascinated by cognitive hacks and how do I make myself sharper, and are there techniques that are emerging? Are there things that I should be thinking about? I'd love to get some of your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, there are researchers who I, really love to follow. Ulrich Boser, who's at UCSB. I'm sure his name has been dropped around here before, but he and others, John Sweller down in Australia, have been doing, just interesting work on cognitive load. So how can we reduce the amount of extraneous information so that people learn more effectively? So one example of this is, having background music in videos, instructional videos, turn out to be less effective. And his most recent work, I find this really powerful, in part because I do like going onto YouTube and watching instructional videos. I had to put together a tent recently and, went on there. And so most instructional videos, as many of your listeners might know, we're on a Zoom right now. So, the person is facing the camera. But it turns out that there's some good evidence from Mayer's lab and others that show that what's actually more effective is to have the camera kind of ride on your shoulder while you're, if you're pulling together the tent or fixing the carburetor. And one of the theories as why this is true is cognitive load, that, if the teacher is facing you, then you have to actually kind of flip everything in your mind as opposed to like riding along on the shoulder. So, to answer your question, in my mind, cognitive load, how
Mm,
can we make sure that people are learning exactly what they're supposed to be
mm,
learning? Some really fascinating stuff on there. And then that one example I find just really powerful when you just look at so many instructional videos, whether they're embedded in a platform or, of course, free for anyone to digest, like something like YouTube, how often this principle is
yeah.
just ignored.
Yeah, and it would argue for more GoPro helmets on instructors, which would be an interesting thing to experiment with. I did want to make sure we spent a little time talking about the lab that you're operating. Can you give our listeners some perspective on that?
Sure. The Learning Agency is actually two different organizations. The Learning Agency Lab is our nonprofit where we're doing a lot of work to share more about the science of learning. So we have sort of a mini magazine blog. We're just really trying to cover what we see as some of the latest developments and trends in this field. And then there's also the Learning Agency, which is more of a consultancy where we're working with organizations and foundations and nonprofits to really push their work and mainly really devoted as a mission-driven organization at a high level to scaling the science of learning. So often seeing people doing things like using highlighters or talking about learning styles where we know there's no evidence, and then some other learning practices, whether it's spacing or cognitive load or retrieval
Yep.
practice, where we know there's a lot of evidence. And what can we do to do some of that translational work within platforms or within ecosystems to really get that information out there to help people become more effective learners?
That's fantastic. Yeah, it's definitely worth a follow, worth tracking. I think I tracked Ulrich down on Twitter, where you're posting on occasion as an individual, and the learning agency and the learning agency lab are the places to find all this work. And then as we wrap up here, Ulrich, I'd love to hear, maybe outside of learning, maybe it relates to learning more broadly, any trends that are capturing your attention. Like what are you seeing emerging on the landscape? What's around the corner? What's sort of maybe an insider's take on what's new and emerging in the world today?
Yeah, I mentioned a little bit about emotion detection and gave the example of struggling students, but really excited about, within the AI space, both in terms of natural language processing, where there's been some interesting work by Sydney DeMello and Angela Duckworth, where they're able to use the language that students write in the Common App to predict their grittiness in college. So the degree to which students talk about struggle and teamwork. So how can we do more to kind of identify, and Ryan Baker has been doing a lot of this work as well, identify that emotion to better figure out, where are they frustrated, where are they excited, use some of these big data tools to improve, instruction. One thing that we feel like is very young and potentially really powerful.
Yeah, and I'd like the crossover move there as well, going from, I think AI, there's almost a tendency to think of it as helping on the cognitive side and not helping on the more emotional, social side. But there's no reason why you can't apply that technology set to solve some of these more emotional problems. So I think that's a real interesting space to keep an eye on. Any parting thoughts, Ulrich? It was great to have you on. Thanks so much for joining.
No, would love to, hear from your listeners, a powerful podcast, and excited to keep up the conversation.
Awesome. Ulrich Boser from the Learning Agency, the Learning Agency Lab. A wonderful resource for folks who are interested in the science of learning and just staying out ahead of where the world is going. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back again soon on Trending in Education.